Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Tyson Fury and his co-promoter Bob Arum are warning off Dillian Whyte, telling him don't try to force that WBC mandatory because we don't want to fight you next, we want Undisputed. So there's a bit to go through in terms of some of the statements and then on to a few thoughts, because I guess typically with boxing, it's never really simple or easy. Things get messy in a heartbeat, and I'm sure Dillian Whyte will want to force his mandatory. Obviously, that is something that is due for February 2021, but Arum, Fury, and the other side as well, they would like to make an undisputed fight next if they can. And obviously that's going to put Eddie Hearn, Anthony Joshua's promoter, also Dillian Whyte's promoter, in a bit of a sticky situation, but we'll come to that later. But in terms of Bob Arum, so a quick quote here from him: if Dillian Whyte forces his mandatory situation, then Mauricio will more than likely upgrade Fury to franchise champion. And the franchise champion, that status is more of a newish thing. Vasyl Lomachenko, he has that currently. It is above the belts. You can't actually lose the status. And say, for example, if Fury fought Joshua, he was the franchise champion. There would be like a diamond belt to the winner type thing. But it's not a designation that he can lose in the ring. So if you're a franchise champion like Lomachenko, you can just continue to fight as the franchise champion. It sort of clears out mandatories. They don't become an issue anymore. But it begs the question, if he becomes a franchise champion, is it really undisputed? And we'll come to that later. But of Tyson Fury, so he's made a number of different comments. And one of them here is, I make him correct. I stole his mandatory position. My answer to Whyte is wait in the queue, mush. I've fought the most vicious punchers in their own countries. I don't fear a stocky plotter who comes forward with no power. And those statements, they were made on Queensberry, that's Frank Warren, his Fury's other co-promoter, on his own YouTube channel. And there's some other statements as well, which I'll get to, also made to Queensberry. Fury saying, I'm about fighting the biggest fights out there, and Wilder Joshua are the biggest fights out there. Dillian Whyte is looking for a payday against me, and Pulev is looking for a payday. All these challenges are not sellable, especially in America. So I'm looking to do colossal fights, the last few fights I have left. I want them to be the biggest possible fights. It won't be a belt or an organization dictating to anybody, because no one has ever dictated to the champion. These low-profile fighters don't mean anything to me. I'm after the biggest fights available. I'm a proud WBC champion, but at the end of the day, I'm the lineal heavyweight champion of the world, which trumps everything. Belts are just pieces of leather with pieces of metal on them, and they don't mean anything to me. And that was also on Queensberry's Lowdown show. So there's quite a bit to unpack there, and I guess if you're on the Dillian Whyte side, you've been waiting for a mandatory shot in the WBC, remembering when Whyte had his UCAD situation, the WBC swooped in and made Tyson Fury the mandatory challenger for 2020 and said, we'll push Dillian Whyte back to February 2021. So had that UCAD situation never have occurred, Dillian Whyte may have had his title shot. But obviously he's still waiting for that fight in the WBC. He's obviously been throwing his lot to some extent in with the WBC route in recent years, turning down other eliminators elsewhere, even turning down a fight with Anthony Joshua for 3 of the 4 heavyweight belts. So, you know, whether it was wise of him to do that, certainly people have been debating that in recent months, etc. But of this situation, I'm sure Whyte would be left fuming if he was pushed out of the way. You've had his promoter Eddie Hearn sort of sitting on the fence to a large extent, sort of saying he would like to have that fight for Dillian Whyte versus Tyson Fury before Undisputed. But if push came to shove, with Dillian Whyte being the number 2 heavyweight in the Matchroom stable, Anthony Joshua being the number 1, I think we know which way Eddie Hearn would likely fall, because an Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury fight for Undisputed, should they keep winning and it's made, it's a much bigger fight. I'm not necessarily saying better, but it's a much bigger fight, especially on the financial end of things, than Dillian Whyte versus Tyson Fury. I'm sure Whyte Fury, which is a big fight in its own right, would generate vast sums of money, but probably not the sort of money that ultimately everyone involved in an Undisputed fight would get, because let's face it, it hasn't happened in a generation. So it's the navigating of this is going to be tricky, because on the other side with Joshua, he's got 2 mandatory challenges. If he gets past Kubrat Pulev, theoretically there would have been Alexander Usyk, but the WBO came out in recent days saying it would be willing to have Usyk fight the winner of Undisputed after it happens. So, with this whole thing, there could end up being some sort of stalemate, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of this ended up in legal action. But just getting back to Bob Arum, so he's throwing the threat out there of, look, if you force this mandatory situation, Mauricio, who is Mauricio Sulaiman, will more than likely upgrade Fury to franchise champion. As I understand it, you have to request that designation. So when Arum is saying that, he's really saying, if you force our hand, we will take that designation because we probably can get it and will get it, which will sort of freeze you out. In that scenario, Whyte would get upgraded to the full champion status. That's what happened in the WBC for Devin Haney. But as a result, people have been trolling Devin Haney quite mercilessly in recent months, calling him the email champion, because obviously he was notified that he'd become the full champion via email. And I'm sure Dillian Whyte would want to be in there, in the ring, earning the belt off Tyson Fury, as opposed to, being labelled a paper champion, as it were. So is this just, a threat here? Is it hollow? Is it something they would likely do? I think if it meant that fight happened next and everyone could make all the sort of money that they wanted, and remembering, when we talk next, we're probably talking at least 2021 for Fury Joshua. So don't, when I say next, I mean after their next fight. So you've still got Wilder for Fury, and you've still got Kubrat Pulev for Joshua. They need to get past those opponents, but seemingly things could line up after that, those fights, for them to get in the ring. And Dillian Whyte may end up being a fly in the ointment, because he doesn't want them fighting, against each other. He wants to be in a fight with Tyson Fury. But there's that whole argument. If Fury is elevated and he's the so-called franchise champion, is it really undisputed? See, I don't think it is. I think that whole designation and the whole, zillion champions that we have existing beyond what are considered the 4 major titles with the 4 different sanctioning bodies. You have all these interim belts and all that sort of stuff. It starts becoming ludicrous and ridiculous. It is ludicrous and ridiculous. But it becomes very, very messy in this situation, especially for Eddie Hearn. And we'll sort of delve into that now, because he's been saying all the right things in public, saying that, it's important to them for Whyte to get his shot before Undisputed. But realistically, when's all this going to happen? Because more than likely, Wilder Fury at the earliest is at the back end of this year, and Joshua Pulev is at the back end of this year at some point as well. And if Whyte is due a shot by February 2021, pretty tight turnaround, and maybe the Wilder and Fury fight actually happens early in 2021. And the question now is, what is the WBC going to do? And if I had to hazard a guess, I don't think they would come down on the side of Dillian Whyte. I think they would sort of more kowtow to Fury and Joshua with the prospect of an undisputed fight, and a big part of that would be money. They would be after their cut in an undisputed fight. Obviously, they want to be having their belt on the line for the most prestigious fights, for the biggest cuts that they can get from whatever percentage it is. I think, 3% or something like that. And if it's a mega fight, they're going to get handsomely paid for their hardware to be on the line. And I guess the other stuff there with Fury, where he says he's not interested in Whyte, and he's talking him down quite a bit, basically saying, low-level fighters, they just want paydays, etc. I'm after the biggest and best fights, etc. Dillian Whyte is one of the bigger fights that Tyson Fury could actually have in the heavyweight division. It's not the biggest, but it's actually a pretty decent-sized and a fight that people would be looking forward to seeing. I would want to see it, but do I want to see it over Undisputed? No, and that's the thing. I think there'd be a minority of people who would want to see that fight over Undisputed, Joshua and Fury, if that could happen. But yeah, Undisputed probably for most people is where it's at. And that leaves Whyte in a precarious predicament, because if the sanctioning body starts to go against him, and you've got these threats from Arum and Fury talking him down something chronic, and some of it, not too flattering at all, what will happen? What would Whyte do? Hearn, his promoter, is obviously in a sort of betwixt and between place. He's going to sort of play a middle ground and just sort of see where this sort of lands. I don't expect him to sort of, turn down Undisputed and really push Dillian Whyte's case over a Joshua fight with Fury, which is, that legacy-defining, once-in-a-generation type fight. We haven't seen it for 20 years or so. So, it's will Whyte force the WBC to give him a shot through legal action? I think you have to start asking that question. He sort of kept his powder dry to this point. Remember, he was talking about potential legal action about a year or so ago. But, this sort of situation, if he feels he's going to get screwed out of a shot, which, who knows, would he ever be able to fight Tyson Fury otherwise? Don't know. If he's talking about, he doesn't no interest and he'd rather drop the belt, it's just a piece of leather, and the WBC could make him a franchise champion, it just may not happen. It could ultimately end in court action. So it's a big move, the warning off of Whyte. And he's going to act none too, favorably to these different comments. And it's quite a few different comments. I've just gone through a small cross-section of them that have been out there in the media. But Arum and Fury adamant, Whyte is going to wait. He isn't going to get in the way of an Undisputed fight, and his mandatory shot can just wait. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.